G'day fellas. One of the most reoccurring themes I've seen over the last week since my patch video is that you guys have wanted an updated tier list. Now before I get into the nitty gritty, it's important that you guys understand tier lists are subjective. Everybody's tier list is different. So if you disagree with my tier list, I encourage you, instead of downvoting the video or writing a rude comment for me to read, post a constructive comment on why you think my tier list is incorrect and how you would improve it. Team games are a lot easier to judge, primarily because the sample size is a lot larger, because you play a lot more team games with a lot more civs. So it means that you're able to see which civilization is continually stronger than other civilizations. So on the tier list for team games, you guys will not be surprised to see Sweden at the top there. Sweden are in their own separate tier just because of how strong they are. Team games naturally are going to be a bit more boomy than 1v1 games, and Sweden is just the king of booms at the moment. In team games, blueberries is incredibly safe. There's never going to be a situation where you don't go blueberries in a team game, and as a result, it just means the Swedish economy is that much bigger than everybody else's. In the next tier down, you've got Japan and Dutch. Now the reason why these two civilizations are above the rest of everybody else is because the booms that they can do are so much bigger and their units are a lot better than other civilizations. So as an example, if you look at the Yumi Archer as well as the Ashigaru for Japan, incredibly strong units. So it means that in the early game, in the mid game, and in the late game, Japan are going to be an incredibly strong pick. With the Dutch, they're a lot stronger in the early and mid game than they are in the late game, just simply because the vil count that you get isn't as high as the other civilizations, but their skirmisher in the second age as well as their ruiter in the third age enables them to be an incredible powerhouse in team games. It means that once the Dutch reaches the third age, your team doesn't even have to build anti-cav. Dutch is going to handle it for you. They're just going to go complete Reuter spam, going to run around the map doing raids, they're going to be chasing enemy raids, and you're going to have no problems whatsoever. In the A tier, we've got the Brits, we've got Portugal, we've got Inca, and we've got India. Now, these civilizations are still able to pull off booms in team games, but not necessarily as strong as what the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Swedish are able to do. So the four civilizations in the A tier are all able to do some sort of boom. So obviously the British are incredibly strong when it comes to booming. Portugal as well, especially with their most recent buff in the patch. India have got some great cards that they can ship, as well as the Ottoman 4 settlers, and the Inca are a powerhouse with their kanchas. So while the British boom is just as quick as the Dutch and the Japanese booms, the main issue that the British have is that they don't really have a strong unit that they can spam. They've got a lot of good units, but they don't have a particularly great unit like the Dutch's Reuter or the Ashigaru and the Yumi for the Japanese. So that sets them apart, it brings them down. Whereas Portuguese, while they're slower than the British, they've got the Janite Dragoon, and their Caçadors as well are incredibly strong in team games. So it means that their units compensate much later in the game. For the Indians, they're able to put out a strong presence in the early game by putting down that forward aggro. And if you're looking to play more defensively, they've also got access to the Zambarak in Age 2, which means that your teammates don't have to worry about anti-cavalry. You can simply tell them to spam skirmishers or strelets, and you'll worry about the cavalry. At the same time, they've still got an economy that they can build up behind that. And then finally, when it comes to the Inca, they are a powerhouse through the early and the mid game just with their cancha houses. They're able to get ahead of the enemy due to those cancha houses, and they're able to have quite a strong boom as a result. Their boom isn't as strong as Sweden, Japan, Dutch, or the Brits, but it still means that they're able to stay ahead of a lot of other civilizations. In the B tier, we've got the Lakota, the French, the Germans, and the Russians. The Lakota are quite strong just because of the bow rider in the second age. Similar to the Indians, they are a Dragoon unit that is available in the second age, which means that your allies can just focus on making those ranged infantry units. And that's really what's going to win when the game is laggy and when there's big balls of units fighting against each other. The ranged infantry is what's going to win. So if you can do that in Age 2 safely by having a Dragoon type unit, which is the Lakota bow rider, then that's going to give you some strength. So while the Lakota civilization's weakness is definitely its economy, it makes up for this by having map control as well as an incredibly fast war chief and axe riders, which it can use to apply pressure to the enemy, to reduce their economy, and to buy time for your teammates. The French are an incredibly versatile civilization. They've got a strong economy late game and some of the strongest units as well. The main issue is that in the early game, their economy isn't going to be as strong as, say, the Swedes, the Japs, the Dutch, or even the Brits, and as a result, it means that they're down in the B tier. Even though they're still a strong civilization in team games, they don't represent as much as a potent threat as the other civilizations above them do. The Germans are somewhat similar in that they also are capable of doing strong booms with the Germantown Farmers card, which enables them to train settler wagons from their farms. With the exception of skirmishers, the Germans don't really have a unit that they can spam, and as a result, it means that they're not very flexible when it comes to team games. They're really only limited to using skirmishers, and that's it. And finally, the Russians, the last civilization in the B tier. The Russians enable you to take map control from the very beginning of the game. They're able to put down that blockhouse, which doubles as the outpost, and allows your team to command map control from the very get-go. They are a little bit slow in the mid game, but once it reaches the late game, they begin to take off again. The main strengths of the Russians are the early early game, where they've got map control, and the late game, where they've got Opronix. In the C tier, we see the Aztecs, the Ottomans, and the Iroquois. Even though the Aztecs are able to pull off large booms, it often comes too late in a team game, and all the other civilizations are well ahead of them in resource count by that time. You don't have any particularly strong units with the exception of the Eagle Runner Knight, but to get those, you're going to need to get to the late game in the first place. So it means that Aztecs are often going to be fighting from behind for the entirety of the game if they're against any civilization that's above them. The Ottomans, while they're equally strong in the early game as a civilization like Russia or India, when it comes to booming in team games, they're incredibly slow compared to their counterparts. They also don't really have a particularly spammable unit. The Janissary is basically the best that they've got, and in team games, Musketeer units aren't the strongest, especially in the mid game. So with its poor unit types, as well as its poor economy, it means that it sits down in the C tier. The only reason why it's not D tier is because it does have the power to all in with civilizations like the Iroquois. The Iroquois, very similar to the Ottomans, in that they don't have a lot of economic potential. They have a huge amount of potential in the early game, with the option of going fast fortress or for a very fast rush. They also provide map control like the Russians do, but because their poor economy and their poor late game, it means that they're relegated to the C tier. In the last tier are the Spanish as well as the Chinese. Often in team games, you're going to be wanting to build one unit type and exclusively one unit type only. Normally, you're going to be focusing on your strengths. With China, however, that's just not an option. So it means that you're forced to be going more than one unit type, and as a result, your mass is affected. Spanish somewhat suffer from a similar problem in that they don't have any particularly strong units that they can spam. While in 1 versus 1, building Rodoleros, Lancers, and Skirmishers is incredibly strong, when it comes to team games, the Lancer and the Rodolero get absolutely shredded in the mid-game team fight simply because they're melee units. So it doesn't give them a lot of options when it comes to the unit type that they choose to build. Combined with the fact that they don't have any real way to get ahead when it comes to the economy, except for Spanish gold. And it means that they sit safely in the D tier. Now we're going to talk a little bit about compositions and what compositions are the best. Now it's impossible for me to cover absolutely every single composition that there is and why it's good, but I'm going to go through just a couple of them and why I think they're incredibly strong. So the first composition has India, and the Indian player is going to be building Zambraks in the Second Age. And the second player is going to be playing either Dutch or Russia, and that player is going to be building Skirmishers or Strelets. And what you've got there in the Second Age is Skirm Dragoon, and it's incredibly strong. So Skirm Goon is probably the strongest unit combination in the game, just because when it gets to larger numbers, the way that unit pathing works, as well as lag, which is something that you often experience, it means that these unit types are the safest unit types, and once you get into big balls battling each other, these ones are going to be the most likely to win. Another incredibly strong combination is Sweden with any civilization that can go cavalry. So that's Sweden and France, Sweden and Germany, Sweden and Brit, Sweden and Lakota. My personal favorite is Sweden and Lakota, just because the Lakota player essentially sacrifices himself in the early game and buys the Swedish player a lot of time. But where you're not teamed up with Lakota, it means throughout the mid game and late game, the Swedish player is going to be making Karolians, which counter dragoons and heavy cavalry. They also trade efficiently with skirmishers, and they beat every single other musketeer unit in the game, and the Cav player is going to be making their respective hand cavalry unit. When it comes to 3v3, I like seeing combinations like Portugal and Japan on the same team, because the Japanese player will be making Yumi archers and the Portuguese player will be making dragoons. Dragoons are incredibly strong for Portugal, especially into the late game. Once you've upgraded them into Janites and shipped the +4 range card, it means that you're going to be having the best dragoon units in the game. Now keep in mind, this is assuming that you play standard. There are other strategies that you can do outside the standard. As an example, there are strategies where you can sling resources to your allies in the early game and boost them ahead. This was a strategy that I utilized back in 2008 at the RTSL Grand Finals, where I was slinged as China by Braden, who was playing the Japanese, and Biobob, who was playing the Dutch. I was able to hit the Fortress Age at 5 minutes and 40 and ship Team Manchu at 6 minutes and 20. These strategies still exist today, but they're not as popular as they once were. I hope that this has provided you some insight as to why certain civilizations are top tier in team games, whereas some just can't cut the mustard. I'll be aiming to do a tier list for 1v1s as well, however it's a lot more subjective in 1v1, and it's a little bit more difficult to judge where a civilization sits, so I encourage you to be patient with me while I work on that video. I hope that you've been able to take something away from this video. Thank you for watching.